Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Samachet. Today's daf is sponsored by Ricky and Alan Zibit in loving memory of Ricky's father, Mickey Carlin, Shevach ben Avraham Zichrono Lebracha, and his 20th year at sight. We miss his energy, his vibrant smile, and his fierce love of his children and grandchildren. May his neshama have an aliyah. Today's daf is dedicated to all the teachers and students returning to school. We're going to get started with our daf. We were learning about someone who sells a bathhouse. And the question is, what is included? And before that, we talked about someone who sells an olive press. And if you want to learn the details about olive presses and ancient olive presses, you can read Shula Mishkan's article in Flashback this week. Yes, I challenged her to deal with it, to come up with an article about it. And she said it was hard work, but she did. And now we're going to continue along. We're in the middle, actually, of a Braita that was parallel to the Mishna about the Beit HaMerchatz. And in general, what we're talking about in this chapter, again, is what is included in the sale of certain items. We'll continue as we go through the chapter. So it says here, and even the next chapter, we're in the middle of the Braita, and it said, if you sell a bathhouse, ben kachu, whether you say it includes everything or doesn't include everything. We're going to learn a bunch of cases like this today, where even if you say everything, it doesn't necessarily mean everything. Still, certain things won't be included. Lo et habrechot, I'm at the very bottom of Samach Zayin Amud. Lo et habrechot hamisapkot lo mayim ben b'yamot hachama uben b'yamot hagshomim, not pools of water that either in the rainy season or in the dry season. Okay, because remember, in the summer months in the area of Israel, for sure, it doesn't rain ever. So what happens? The water dries out. So when the water dries out, you might say, well, there's not much water in here anyway, so maybe it would be sold. And comes this Braita to teach you, no, it's not. Now, why is it not included? Because even though the water might serve the use of the bathhouse, the water is used for many other things as well, not only for the bathhouse. And that's why even if you said everything and all the things that serve this bathhouse, since the pool of water or the reservoir or whatever it might be, doesn't only support the bathhouse, and like the next case, below beit kinus hayitzim, where they would collect wood. Now, it's true they use the wood to warm the water in the bathhouse, but they also use the wood for many other things. And therefore, it's not included in the sale, even if you say everything, and all of the things that serve the needs here. So again, so now you have to, maybe I wasn't clear with my language, actually. We had hi v'chomasha betocha, this bathhouse and everything that's in it. That doesn't include things that serve it but aren't in it. But if you said actually anything that serves it, I used the wrong language before, sorry, that was my mistake. If you say anything that serves the needs of this bathhouse, then you will include even things that serve other needs, but also the needs of the bathhouse will be included. And therefore the pools, the water, whether it's pools, reservoirs, whatever it might be, and the house that stores the wood would be included because you use this extra language. And as again, every time we've been saying this over and over, you use extra words that must be coming to include something additional. That's the only thing additional that could be included. So if you say everything in it, that includes, all sorts of things that are in it that weren't included originally. But if you say everything that serves its needs, then that would include those additional things as well. So now we're going to have a case, not about a bathhouse, but we're going to use this source. We're going to go back to the olive press. I'm selling you the Beit Habad and everything that serves the olive press, okay? So now we have a case. There were these stores outside. That's outside where the bathhouse was. Outside of the olive press. They used it for drying out the sesame seeds before they crushed them. Now here you learn an olive press wasn't just for pressing olives, it was for pressing sesame as well. Now, the issue with these stores they were stores. They weren't just drying out sesame seeds there. They were selling all sorts of other things. So it's kind of like the two cases we just saw, where they weren't serving the needs exclusively of the bathhouse, but they were used by the bathhouse. So likewise here, they were used by the press, but they weren't only serving the needs of the press. They also were stores. So Amar lei Tanina. So the case was brought before Rav Yosef, and he said to them, Tanina, im amar beit hamerchatz v'chol tashmishav ani mocher lecha harei elu mechurin. We just learned this. Right? Comes Rav Yosef and says, We can learn it from that Braita. It says the bathhouse and all the things that serve it, it's included. Amar le Abaye. Abaye says, what are you talking about though? V'hatane Rabbi Chia, ein kulam mechurin. But Rabbi Chia's version of the Braita, he taught us a Braita that said they're not sold. Now, you could look at this in two ways, and we're going to see sugya like this later on today, where, okay, we have one source that says they're sold with it, one source that says they're not included in the sale, and we could say two different approaches. But whenever we're able to come up with a solution, the Gemara prefers to come up with a way to resolve the contradiction. So comes Rav Ashi later, okay, and Rav Ashi comments here, Elam Rav Ashi chazdinan. It really depends. We look at the situation. If you say the following, I'm selling you the olive press and everything that serves the needs of the olive press, and here are the boundaries. Now, you designate where the borders are. And if that store is included in the borders, then the store is included. So if the store serves the needs of the olive press or the bathhouse, whatever it might be, and you said, here are the borders, that's when the Braita says. So this all of a sudden takes the Braita that we said, as soon as you say all the needs, serves the needs of this place, it will be included. No, according to now Rav Ashi's resolution, because Rabbi Chia had a different version, and we want to reconcile it all together, we say, well, it really depends. If you added the words, and these are the borders, and it happened to be in the borders of what you designated, then it would be included in the sale. Below, but if you didn't say, and these are the borders, then if it serves the needs of the bathhouse or the olive press, but also is used for many other things, then it's not included in the sale, lo kani. So again, what Rav Ashi does is reconcile these two contradictory Braitot or versions of the Braita. But like I suggested, it could be that these were really two different approaches. And some people thought yes, some people said no. But the conclusion of the Gemara is it depends on whether you added these extra words. New Mishna. If you sell a city, it sounds a little silly. Why people sell cities? What does that mean? First of all, people over the course of history have bought cities. The Quran has a good footnote where they basically say we're talking about a small settlement here, maybe a place with a bunch of farms and a bunch of houses, and somebody privately owned it and then sold parts of it to people. And perhaps that's what we're talking about, or not that they sold, but that houses are, like, let's say I own the area, the settlement. I sell kind of like more like rent to other people, these houses and other things. So if I were to sell that city, I were to sell all the houses, and exactly we're going to see what is included in my sale of this city. So the Quran uses the word settlement and also uses the word estate. Perhaps you call it like a big estate where somebody sells, their big estate. Okay, so here's obviously different from when you sell a house. Here you're selling a city. It's not only going to include the houses, it's also going to include the ditches, the pits, all those things. Bathhouses, and the dovecotes. Beit habadin u beit hashlachin, any olive presses or bathhouses, because again, that's all part of the property of this big estate, settlement, city, whatever you want to call it. Avalot metaltalin, but not movables. All the movables in the city don't belong to the person who owns the city and therefore not passed on. Or even if they were owned by the person who owns the city, that wasn't part of the sale agreement. Ubizman shamarlo, and we're already used to this, ki v'chomasha b'tocha, but if you say it and everything in it, now we're missing the key words here. What does it mean? You obviously include all the metaltalin, right? All the movables would then be included, and we've seen this from before. But now they say the following. They don't say metaltalin. We assume they mean metaltalin, and it says even. Even means in addition to the basic, which would be the metaltalin, even hayu b'beimot b'avadim, even animals and slaves. Now, why is it an even? We're going to have to deal with that. Okay, it sounds like they're saying, and I'm going to say this specifically to set up what the Gemara is going to do, just so you get clear what the simple reading is. Land, anything that's land or attached to the ground is included in the sale. Anything that's movable is only included if you add the words and everything in it. And then we're going to include movables and even movables like animals and slaves. That's going to raise a big problem in the Gemara. We'll get there. Rashbag Gamliel, hamocher et ha'ir, machar et santer. Rashbag adds that if you sell a city, you sell the santer. Santer in Hebrew means a chin. We obviously don't mean chin. Okay, so what is santer? We're going to have to wait and see. So now the Gemara is going to ask, and Erica, this is appropriate. This is your question. Okay, the Gemara is going to ask. Now, I'll already preface this by saying there's a sugya on Daf Kuf Gimel, where we're going to have a debate. Slaves, we're talking about Caananite slaves. I want to be clear. Whenever we talk about slaves in Canaanim, we usually talk about Caananite slaves who are more acquired by the owner as opposed to a Jewish slave where the laws are different. And every time we talk about them, right, there is no such thing anymore as slaves. We don't have this anymore, but it was something that existed in those times and is very much addressed in the Gemara and many Mishna and Gemara on many occasions. But slaves, by Torah law, it says, "V'nachaltem etchem," I forgot the exact words, "libnotechem acharichem," something like that, which means you're going to pass them on as nachala, which means it's treated like land. So slaves are treated like land by Torah law. However, there's a debate on Daf Kuf Gimel. If somebody says, I'm selling all of my possessions, okay, I want to actually see the exact words. 1 second. Right. If you say, kol mitaltalai, I'm selling all my movable property, okay, ani makneh leploni, I'm selling to Ploni, do they include slaves? Now, why is there a deliberation here? And this is something we've discussed many times. And a very interesting issue, which is, while Torah law might say and might categorize slaves as land, most of us don't really view slaves as land. And therefore, when somebody uses their speech and they say, I'm selling you all my movables, since generally the perception is, or many people view, or that's really the question, does the average person view slaves as land or movables? Because if what the Torah law doesn't really matter when I say all my movables, it's what I intended in the sale. That's the whole question. We've been discussing this whole chapter. What I intended is what matters, not what the Torah classifies what's metaltal and what's karka. Now, you might have thought that would be how we would categorize it, by the Torah law, or by, do we follow, and that's really the question, do we follow what people mean? And what people, and this came up in Nidarim, when it all matters, right? I forbid something to myself. It's all matters what I meant when I said it. And what I meant, what I said, often goes by what people use on the street and what the general accepted explanation is. So that's a big deliberation. Now, that would be the same thing here. If there's a deliberation there, then the issue is going to be like this. There, they don't know. Did I mean metal? Right? When I said metalton, did I mean slaves or not? Which means that they should have used our Mishnah as proof, right? So now, if the way I read the Mishnah, which is that, kol masha b'tocha includes movables, even slaves, then that would imply very clearly that slaves are metaltalin when it comes to sales. And then we'd have a very easy answer there. But we don't answer from our Mishnah. Because we don't answer from our Mishnah, that means maybe we're not reading, maybe there's some problem with our Mishnah. So, or maybe there's some issue here. So let's read the Gemara on this. Amalei Rav Acha bereid Rav Avia le Rav Ashi. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avia, says to Rav Ashi, Shema mina avda k'metaltalei dami. Well, you should have a clear answer from here, and it's really a question, because if there's a clear answer, then why didn't they say this? There was a clear answer from our Mishnah. To the big deliberation, are slaves considered like metaltalin when it comes to sales? What do people mean? Because if it was like karka, nizdabin agav mata, it should have been sold with the city, even without my saying kol mash v'tocha. It's in the wrong section of the Mishnah, basically. So now Rav Ashi answers, ve'elamai avda k'metaltalei dami. Rav Ashi says, what? You want to say it's metaltalin? Okay, well, I have a problem with your explanation. My afilu. So why does it say even? Right? It should just say, this includes metaltalin and animals and slaves. But it says even slaves. Now, why would it say even slaves? If slaves are land, you're saying it should be in the first section. If slaves are movables, it should be where it is. But it shouldn't say even. It should be just listed there. So, how can I explain this afilu, he says? Shane be metalate denade lemitaltala delonayit. He says, why does it say afilu? Because it's saying not only movables, but even movables that move on their own, okay, as opposed to movables that are usually inanimate objects. So according to that, what he's saying is you have no choice but to explain that there's a difference between, even if they're metaltalin, they're not the same as regular metaltalin because of the afilu. In what way are they not the same? Well, they move. And that's why you have to say the word afilu. Well, if you're already doing that, afilu tema avdikim karke dami, you could also say that slaves are like land. And now I'm going to explain it the way with option B. Slaves are like land. However, but it's land that moves. So because it's land that moves, it's actually not going to be included in a regular sale of land. However, of the city. However, if you say everything in it, then it will include things that are like land, categorized like land, but are animate objects and move. And therefore, that's why it says even. And therefore, you can't necessarily conclude from here that avadim go in the category of movable items. But again, don't get confused between movables and things that move. Those are two different things, right? Movables are things that can be moved, and movable things that move are things that actually can move on their own. So therefore, we have two ways to read this, and this is going to be the theme of what we're going to continue with. Today, there's going to be a lot of different ways of reading different things. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, mocheret ha'ir macharet santer. Now we're going to have a long sugya about trying to figure out what a santer is. We're going to start with explaining two different explanations that people give, and then we're going to try to figure out, can we figure out which one is a better explanation or the right explanation? And the answer is going to be no. So the Gemara says, my santer, hachatir gamu bar machavanita. Here they explained it, meaning in Babylonia or wherever they were in Babylonia, they explained it as bar machvanita. What is bar machvanita? It's a person. Okay, just like we saw, slaves can get sold. If you sell a city, the person who's in charge, like the registrar of keeping track of who owns what properties, where are the borders of the properties. Well, if you're selling the estate, so you're selling, or the settlement, you're selling the person that takes care of all, keeping track of everything. Shimon ben Avtum Somer Bage. Totally different explanation. The fields. What's the story with the fields? Well, if you remember, the cities, the way they worked then in those days, there were cities where people lived. Outside the city were the fields. So not only are you selling the city, but you're selling the fields. That's what Rashbag says. And remember, Tanakh disagrees, where you could see why there would be logic, because the fields are not in the city, they're outside the city. If you want to sell the fields also, you would say the fields. And Rashbag says, what do you mean? The fields are basically these are the fields that belong to that city. It's part of the sale. So now the Gemara is going to try to figure out which one is a better explanation. Now, we had the beit hashlachin earlier in the Mishna. So we had marchatzot, shavachot, beit abadin, and beit hashlachin. Now, what is beit hashlachin? Usually when we talk about beit hashlachin, it's fields that live on rainwater alone. They don't need irrigation. That's what a beit hashlachin is. So comes the Gemara and says, and we're going to actually, this is going to be the kind of sugya where we're going to have two different versions, which are each mirror images of the other. Okay, where one starts, the other one ends. And either which way, it's going to be inconclusive. Or the truth is, you could say it's conclusive, but the second version is going to come to the exact opposite conclusion, which is going to make it entirely inconclusive. So if that wasn't confusing enough, let's read the sugya. Tanan, beit habadinu beit hashlachin. So the first part of the Mishnah, which is Tanakama, says the beit habadin and the beit hashlachin, so the olive presses, which is not important for our purposes, and the beit hashlachin are included in a sale. Again, Rashbag says the santer is also included, which means Tanakama doesn't think it's included. Sabruha, they thought at first, my shlachin bage, beit hashlachin is fields. Okay, so now, dichtiv, why did they think beit hashlachin is fields? Now we're going to see why they always say beit hashlachin is a field. Because there's a pasuk in Eov that says God is the one who sends water. When we talk about sending, we're talking about water, rainwater, and the rainwater is what provides the sustenance to this field. So it's called a beit hashlachin because the thing that gets sent, which is the rain, is what provides, its needs. So therefore, a beit hashlachin is a field. So if you say it's the registrar of the city, Amar Tanakama Bage Mizdabne, Bar Machvanita Lo Mizdabin. So Tanakama is saying the fields are sold, because that's the beit hashlachin, and not the person who's, though, in charge of designating whose field belongs to who. Rabban Shimon Gamliel, and then Rabban Shimon Gamliel makes perfect sense. He comes to add even the registrar is included in the sale. But if you say it's a field, Tanakama also says the fields are included. So it can't be that Rashba is coming to say fields are included when Tanakama already said fields are included. Obviously, Rashba comes to disagree. So that doesn't make any sense. To which the Gemara says, now, if you want to go with option 2 of santer, you're going to have to say maybe beit hashlachin means something else from what you thought. So, misavar my shlachin bage, who says that beit hashlachin, even though we've seen many Mishnayot where beit hashlachin is fields, but perhaps in this context, beit hashlachin doesn't mean fields. My shlachin, or lo, no, it's not that. My shlachin, ginunuyata. It's gardens. What are gardens? Green spaces inside the cities, right? Well, we all know that when you build a city, there's always certain spaces that are designated as green spaces. We're going to make parks there and other things. That's in the city. That's what Tanakama says, beit hashlachin. The gardens are included. The fields outside the city are not included. And then, right now, why would we think that shlachin is a garden? Where do we get that from? Another pasuk. In Shiur HaShirim, it says, Ne'amar shlachayich pardes rimonim. Shlachayich, your gardens are full of, right, they're orchards full of pomegranates. It's a way of saying how beautiful your, right, it's obviously a metaphor here, but it would be saying gardens are full of these pomegranates. Avabage lo mizdabne. So Tanakama now says, if you're selling the city, and this makes a lot of logical sense, the gardens inside the city are included, and the fields outside the city are not included, and the not to Rabban Shimon Gamliel comes Rashbag and says, no, I even think the fields outside the city are included. So we tried to say, based on our interpretation of beit hashlachin, we would reject option that it's a field, and it must be that santer is actually the person. In the end, we say, no, it actually makes more sense to say we could, if we explain beit hashlachin, it's not exactly clear if the Gemara is concluding here, although it does sound like they're concluding. No, once we explain beit hashlachin as garden, we can explain beit hashlachin as fields. Santer as fields. But now we're going to have the opposite version, which starts from the end and goes back to the beginning. So it's just going to be the exact same sugya in reverse order. Some people say savrua. Originally, they thought my shlachin ginuniata. They thought that the shlachin was the gardens, and then obviously said, well, then the field makes the most sense. Bishlam alamand amar bage amar tanakama gininuta mizdaben bagi lo mizdaben. Ater mashpag lememar afilu bage mizdaben. If you start with shlachin is gardens, then it reads much better as saying gardens are included, fields are not. Comes back to say even fields, because where do we get to the registrar? From gardens, right? Now, why do we think these two are definitely connected? They just assume. So now, therefore, we would say it's fields. Ela lamanda amar bar machvanita, turning out amubet. If you say, though, it's the person in charge of the fields, amar tanaginu niyata, and this is what I just said a minute ago, the Tanakama is going to say gardens, umahadale ram shimon gamliel bar machvanita, and then all of a sudden, Rashbag is going to talk about the person who's in charge of designating, of delineating whose fields belong to who. What does that have anything to do with this? Even the fields aren't included. Why would you include the person? So, to which the Gemara rejects, as we can guess, based on the beginning of the previous version, misavar my shluchin ganuniata lo my shlachin bage. Who's to say that shlachin is gardens? Why don't we just assume shlachin is fields? Dichtiv v'shalech mayim al pnei chutzot, based on a different pasuk. Aval bar machvaniata lo mizdaben. Right, the fields are included, but not the registrar. Rabban Shimon Gamliel, and then comes Rashbag to say even the registrar is included in the sale, and that's the machloka between them. And then santer could mean the person in charge. So, in the end, as I said, the first version seems to. It's not clear that they're clear on it, but it does start with they thought this, and then they said that, which seems like, so then they think that it must be fields. And in the second version, they actually say it must be the registrar. And from there, we can't really conclude anything because we have two opposite versions here. Now we're going to attempt a second try. It's really a third because we had two different versions, but that was all the first try, which just had two different versions of the first try. Here's the second attempt to try to figure out which definition is a better definition. But again, we're not going to have a conclusion. Tashma, let's learn from the following source. Now we're going to have another source that's kind of parallel to the source we were learning, to our Mishnah, but has a different opinion here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, santer eino machor, which sounds like Rabbi Yehuda holds like the rabbis, because Rashbag says the santer is sold. Ankulmus machur, but the ankulmus is sold. What is the ankulmus? Rashi says the ankulmus is the sofer of the king. Lichtov mispar hasadot abatim banashim. This is a different kind of registrar. Sounds a little similar, but we'll see. Obviously, the Rabbi Yehuda thinks to distinguish here how many fields, how many houses, how many people, in order for what purpose? For the tax purposes. Okay, whereas it sounds like the first explanation we had, or the one explanation we had of santer, if it was a person, we were talking more about someone who keeps, who lives in which area or whose fields are in which area. Not clear whether they mean house borders or field borders. The Gemara seems to think the borders of the fields. Did I say Rashi? Oh, sorry, I meant Rashbam. Thank you for correcting. Rashbam. So many years of being Rashi, but sometimes I get confused. So the Rashbam basically says here that Unkumus is the person in charge for tax purposes, okay? Not for borders, but for borders for tax purposes. So why one would be included and one wouldn't, one could come up with logic, and we're going to see that they're going to switch the version, which one is included, which one isn't. So I could try to come up with a logic, but then when we switch it, we're going to have to come up with the opposite logic. Either which way, one of them is included, one is not. According to this first version, Rabbi Yehuda says the santer is not sold with the city, and the ankulmus is sold with the city, which again, the logic could be for tax purposes, right? Again, who's collecting the taxes? Probably the person who owns the city. So maybe the tax person would be more likely included. So now they assume here, if we're comparing the santer to the ankulmus, and as I already kind of indicated, my lav mida ankulmus gavra, santer nami gavra. Well, the most obvious interpretation is Rabbi Yehuda is distinguishing between the registrar for purposes of boundaries and the registrar for the purposes of taxes. One is included, one is not included, and then it makes sense that they're next to each other. But to say one is fields and one is the tax person, not necessarily, to which the Gemara says, no, totally could be. Midi iria, hakadita bahakadita. What do you mean? Rabbi Yehuda mentioned two things. One could be the land and one could be the person. Doesn't mean just because they're next to each other in this breita. You're going to see there's a whole long list of things in this breita. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're both humans, and therefore it could be fields. So the Gemara rejects this option and says it could be fields. But we're not finished yet, because now the Gemara is going to say, if you're going to suggest that it's fields, we're going to have another problem, because let's look at the continuation of this breita. They just cut off the breita, cut this little, like a cut and copy, and said, okay, let's take this and bring it in. But they left off the rest, which could be very telling. So the Gemara says, could you really say that it's a field? And meaning, right, he rejected saying it was a person by saying, or at least by concluding it was a person by saying it could be a field. But you can't really say it's a field, because Hakatani Seifa, after that it says, Avalo shiareha, velo benoteha, velo chorashim hamuktzin la, velo bibarin shechayav shalafov shaldagim. Okay, let's go one by one. Shiareha, we're going to explain, so I'm going to leave it right now. Shiareha means the remainder, really, but we're going to have to see what that means. Benoteha are little villages that are right next to the city, but not part of the city. So those aren't included. Not the chorashin hamuktzin, which right now we're going to interpret as forests that are designated for that city. Okay, not the forest, they're not included. And not bibarin, which are these enclosures of animals, birds, and fish. Okay, fish, they say, are more like fish ponds. Okay, or for the others, it's because there are no really cages for fish unless you stick fish in a fish bowl, but we're not talking about that. Pools of fish, okay, all these things, they are not included in the city. So we'll get to the other things soon, but right now we're going to focus on the shiareha. So now the Gemara says, Amrina, my shiareha, what does this mean? The remainders, we don't know what that means. Bizle, okay, bizle doesn't really help us. It didn't really help them either. So now they say, my bizle, what are bizle? Amar Rabbi Abba, piske bage. Okay, now what's piske bage? This is bage, or the fields. So you have a city, you have fields, and then you have, sometimes there's like an area beyond the field where it's rocky and you can't plant there. And then there's a field beyond that. So comes this Braita to say, and this is the continuation of Rabbi Yehuda, Piske bagi hu dilomas davne, the part where the fields are beyond, where there's an area in between the regular fields and the fields, it's almost like a natural separation. There's fields, there's an area that's rocky that you can't plant, and then there's fields behind that. Those fields are not included. Now, if you say the extra fields are not included, what does that talk about the regular fields? The regular fields must be included in the sale. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to say the part beyond the fields that's beyond this rocky area where you can't plant anymore isn't included. Once the fields aren't included, obviously, those extra parts aren't included. So let's read it inside. Piske bage hu delom is davne. It's those parts beyond there that aren't sold. Ha bage atzmam is davne. So the fields themselves must be included. And therefore, again, reading Rabbi Yehuda, santer is not sold, and the benoteha are not sold. I'm sorry, and the sheyareha are not sold. Well, it can't be fields are not sold, and the part beyond the fields aren't sold. Obviously, if the fields aren't sold, they're not. So it can't be fields. It must be a person. And now we're back to saying you can't suggest it's a field. To which the Gemara, to resolve this, says, Ipuch, why don't we just switch what Rabbi Yehuda said? Because remember, Rabbi Yehuda said one is sold and one isn't sold. So instead of saying the santer is not sold and the alkulmus is sold, why don't you say the alkulmus isn't sold and the santer is, and then it says, oh, but not the extra part of the field. So now we read it as the fields are sold, the tax guy is not sold, and the parts of the fields that are beyond where there's this rocky area that you can't plant, beyond that are not sold, even though the regular fields are. The order in the Braita is a little bit strange if you say that, but okay. You could come up with explanations for that. So let's read it inside. Ipuch, Rabbi Yehuda Omer santer machor, ankumus eno machor. And that's how they basically want to say, we can still leave it open with both possibilities. Either we go with the first version, the santer isn't sold, the ankumus is, and we're talking about a person, or we go with version 2, that it's a field, and we'd have to switch what Rabbi Yehuda said. However, we're going to have a side question on that version, the second one. Because if you say the fields are sold, right, and the ankumus is not sold, well, that puts Rabbi Yehuda agreeing with Rashbag, because now that we switched the girsa, originally we read Santeri no machor, Rabbi Yehuda matched Tanakam. Now Rabbi Yehuda, because that's how we got to Santer in the first place, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel in our Mishna said Santer is not sold. So right now, we have to, what's the problem? So you could say Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rashbag, but we're going to have a problem with that. Rabbi Yehuda could we really say that Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rashbag? Because we're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rashbag on a different issue about this Mishnah, or this topic of our Mishnah. Not our Mishnah, because Rashbag only talked about the santer in our Mishnah, but there's another source that talks about Rashbag disagreeing with something we just saw Rabbi Yehuda says. V'ha Rabbi Yehuda k'Rabbanan sfirale. That's a question. V'ha Rabbi Yehuda, Ha Rabbi Yehuda k'Rabbanan sfirale. Rabbi Yehuda holds like the rabbis, and that's clear from this other line. Dikatani seifa, because what did we just read in the name of Rabbi Yehuda? Lo shiareha v'lo benoteha. V'ilu Rashbag, so not the extra parts of the fields, and not the villages that are right nearby. V'ilu Rashbag said, Ha'amal machar te'ir machar benoteha. We know, and we're going to tell you how we know this in a minute, that Rashbag holds if you sell a city, you sell the villages that are nearby. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, we're going to quote another Braita. Ha-mocher ta'ir lo machar benoteha. Tanakama says you sell a city, you don't sell the villages nearby are not included. Rashbag omer, but Rashbag says ha-mocher ta'ir machar benoteha. So there you have it. It can't be. Now here's an interesting theory. If Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rashbag about the villages, the benoteha, obviously he disagrees with Rashbag across the board about all these issues, like the santer. In which case you can't switch the girsa to say santer machor, according to Rabbi Yehuda, because then he would match Rashbag on one issue and disagree with him about the other. And therefore, let's just review, that means santer can't be fields, because otherwise it makes no sense. Rabbi Yehuda says the fields are included. I'm sorry, the fields are not included, and the extra part beyond the fields are not included. That makes no sense. It has to be a person. To which the Gemara says, no, who's to say just because Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rashbag on one issue, he's going to disagree with him about everything? You could say Rabbi Yehuda savar lekavate b'chad, u'palagalei b'chad. Maybe he agrees with Rashbag on one issue and disagrees with him on another. It's very possible. The santer issue, he agrees. The benotai, he doesn't agree, and we're left with all possibilities. So, as I've told you from the beginning, we're not going to have a conclusion what santer means. Now, just to finish up this section before we get to the next Mishnah, and then we'll finish with our daf with that Mishnah, is what about that line about the bibarim? Now we want to understand that line, and really they're bringing this up because there's a contradictory source. And again, as I mentioned before, contradictory sources could mean different opinions, but if the Gemara could reconcile them, they'd much prefer to do that, and we're going to have a reconciliation to this contradiction. And with that, it will affect also the way we read this chorashina muktzin la, which we're going to see maybe means something a little different. So these are enclosures where they would kind of keep animals or birds or fish. Again, fish, it's like a pool of fish. Urimidhi. So we, according to Rabbi Yehuda in this Braita, it said that's not included in a sale. Urimini. There's a different source that says Hayula banot einim karotima. Again, banot doesn't mean daughters here. Usually that's what it means. Banot here means villages. It's not included in the sale, which sounds like what Rabbi Yehuda said. Okay, this is very hard to understand. Sounds a little like it reminded me of Paul Revere, one in the land and one in the sea. Okay, a little different version, but yes. So what does this mean? It has nothing to do with Paul Revere. It was just what I thought of when I read it. But it says, some people think we're talking about if the city was more on the water, like more of an island, but there was a little in the land, or meaning most of it was by the sea, and most of it was by the land, a little bit in the sea. Okay, either or. Yes, I know it's one by land, two by sea. I know it just sounded like that. So anyway, there's different ways of explaining this, what exactly this means, but let's say there was part of it in the water, part of the city, or perhaps it was a part that's near the city that's in the water, or it's mostly an island and there's a part that's in the land that goes by the same name as the city, okay, where they have the same name, unclear exactly. Or bibarin shachayav shalafofa shel dagim. Now that's really why we brought this, because of the bibarin. Hare elu nimkarim ima. Okay, that specifically is sold with the city. Okay, so now we have a problem because the Braita said the bibarim are not, and this says they are. Lo kashya. Hadinigiach kai legav, hadinigiach kai leval. Okay, legav and lebar we know. Some people pronounce it as lego or legav. Legav means the inner, and bar means outside. So what does it mean? Well, where do these enclosures open? Do they open toward the city, or do they open in the other direction? Meaning they're not accessible from the city. If they're not accessible from the city, they're on the outside. They don't belong to the city. They're not part of the sale. If they're accessible on the inside, to the inhabitants of the city, and it opens right there, then it's going to be considered part of the city, okay, and will be included in the sale. So now they say, wait, there's one problem. What did we say in that Braita? Not the bibarin and not the chorashin hamuktzim la. Now, what did muktzim la mean? Okay, I want to just review. The term muktzah that we use for muktzah for Shabbat means designated. Okay, now you might think, what does muktzah have to do with designated? So muktzah means it's designated for something, okay? Like muktzah is often designated, okay, the muktzah was actually where they would get the real term muktzah from in Shabbat. When we say, oh, it's muktzah, don't touch it, don't move it. First of all, don't touch is not true. You could actually touch it, you can't move it. What's the issue? Well, the muktzah was the place where they would dry out their fruits on the roof. And it was designated because nobody would touch them. Now, anything that you're not planning to touch, meaning you set something aside, it's really like set aside, not for use on Shabbat, let's say, okay, or not for use at all, that's muktzah, because it's not usable for Shabbat, okay? People don't know this, but even like magnets on a refrigerator, you're not supposed to take on and off on Shabbat because you stuck them there on your fridge to be on your fridge, or a picture in a frame, theoretically, is muktzah, because it's designated to be there for decorative purposes. You're not planning to move it for any reason, so it's not necessary, right? So you could say that's muktzah, and then it has no use on Shabbat. That's the whole idea of muktzah. The most muktzah object are stones and things like that, which have no use for Shabbat. They're not usable at all, or they're not meant for use. And what's not meant for use? Something that's set aside. So it says here, lo tachorashin ha-muktzin la, not the chorashim that are designated for use of the people of the city. Well, that doesn't make sense. If we just said, if the enclosures of the animals that are open to the city are meant for the city inhabitants to get in there, then that's part of the sale. So wouldn't you think then the forests that are meant, designated for the city inhabitants should be included? And said they're not. To which they say, well, if we're going to resolve this contradiction, and the way we resolved it, we have no choice but to change what it says in that Braita. Ema hamuktzin heimena. Hamuktzin heimena means they're designated to be not for the use of the people in the city. Like, let's say the forest, there was a nearby town, and that person, who owns that town took over the forest and said, no one from your town is allowed to come in and cut my forest. Then it would not be included in the sale. And then we have to switch the wording because that's not what it said. If we want to accept the reconciliation of this contradiction between the bibarim, are they included, they're not included, by saying, if they're designated for the city, they are, not designated, they're not. Again, the word designated wasn't used, but opening means they're designated for that city. So then you would have to change the wording in the Chorshin to make that work. Okay, last part of today's daf, Mishna. Hamocher et hasadeh. We're now moving to what's included in the sale of a field. And this Mishnah is going to line up what's included, what's not included, and they're obviously going to be totally parallel. We're going to have this thing that is and this thing that's not the same item. The stones that are used, I just said stones, right, are usually not used for anything, but sometimes stones are used for something. So stones that are used for the purpose of that field will be included. We're going to have to see what kind of stones, even though the stones are movable, they will be included if they're, so we'll get to the Gemara and we'll figure out what these stones were used for. There's different ways of interpreting whether we're talking about in the sale of a field and all of a sudden we're talking about reeds in a vineyard. Some people think that it means if it was a sale of a vineyard, then it would include the reeds. Some people think in a sale of a field, it includes even a vineyard that's in that field, and that it will also include the reeds. Two different ways to read this, which has big ramifications for if I say field, will it include a vineyard that's in that field or not? That's a huge ramification, but we're not going to focus on it now. So the reeds that are in the kerem that serve the vineyard, okay, what are those going to be? That you would, right, the kfanim, they would just kind of, drape all over the place. So you would attach them. We do this all the time, right? Things that grow like a vine, we attach to reeds so that they don't fall on the ground. Okay, so these are all things that are very much needed for that field or that vineyard. If we have grain that's attached to the ground, so obviously if I'm selling the field, I'm selling whatever's in it. Right? If the sale is going through today, then whatever's growing in the field still is mine, is the person who's buying it. If reeds grew in clusters and they designated this area that's smaller than a beit rova, which means you can't plant more than a quarter kav of produce, that also is going to be part of the sale because it's not significant in and of itself. If it designates, what we're going to see in the second part of the Mishnah, if it designates an area that's larger than a quarter kav, then already it has significance. And then we're going to say this stands, it's like its own field, stands separate from the field, and it's not included in the sale. If you have a booth for a guard, the guard would either sit and watch, also sometimes sleep there, okay, but it's not plastered with clay, then it's very flimsy, and then again, it's not its own unit, and it's considered part of the sale of the field. Okay, here also the Kohen had a great footnote about carob trees. According to the footnote I read there, carob trees that grow in the wild are very strong, but their fruits aren't so great, right? Normally you go on these tiyulim, you see these carobs are very dry. But if you graft that strong carob tree with a carob tree that has good fruits, then you'll actually produce very juicy carobs. Remember, we were talking before about juicy carobs that drip down. So you'll have juicy carobs. And so here we have one that's not grafted, okay, which again is less significant because it doesn't have good fruit. At Betulata Shikma, the sycamore tree was used mostly for its wood. And even though there were fruits, but it was used mostly for its wood. And we're talking about a young tree that doesn't have good enough wood yet to cut. So all that is just connected with the field because it doesn't have significance on its own. However, lo machal, okay, so those things are all included in a sale. What's not going to be included? And here's just the obvious parallels. Lo machar lo et avanim sheinan letzorkach. There's stones that are not serving the needs of the field, lo etakanim shebekerem sheinam letzorko, reeds in a vineyard that they're not using, don't serve the needs of the vineyard, lo etatfuashi tlusham in a karka, any grains that are already picked from the land, even if they're sitting there, it doesn't matter, that's not part of the sale. But here we're going to have a split in the cases. But if I said everything in the field, then the reeds and the stones and the grains will be included. However, category 2 here, ben kach ben kach, but whether you said everything is included or not, lo machar lo et chitzat kanim shi beit rova, lo et shomera shi asiya betit, lo et charuv amurkav, lo et sadan shikma. The sadan shikma is the opposite of the betulat shikma. The betulat is the young one. The sadan is the older one that's very strong and solid that people use for the wood. So if you have these reeds separating a bigger area, or you have this booth for the guard that's already plastered with clay, you have the grafted carob tree, and you have this big sycamore tree, none of those will be included, even if you say everything in here. That's not included in everything in here. Everything in here are more the movables that are sitting there, but it doesn't include the following things. Okay, so quick review of our daf. We started with this issue about something that serves two different purposes. Is it included? Is it not? What language do you have to say exactly to say this was included in the sale? We thought it was just kol tashmishav. At the end, we see, well, it's not even kol tashmishav. You'd have to say kol tashmishav, and these are the borders, and it's included within the borders. Then we got to the city, what's included, what's not. The first issue we dealt with was, it seems pretty clear from here that slaves are metaltalin. In the end, we said no. They could be like karka, but still are in the second part of the Mishna because they're karka that moves. And then we said rashbag, what is santer? And then we had two explanations and two different attempts. The first one with two different versions to figure out which is the right one, but we didn't conclude. And then once we quoted in the second one, a braita with Rabbi Yehuda, who added some other things, we then wanted to deal with the other things he added, like the bibalin, and that contradicted a different braita, and how do we reconcile those? And then we had to change a word about the chorshin, because that all didn't mix in. And then we finished with what is included in the sale of a field, which that is obviously what we're going to deal with tomorrow when we get to the Gemara on that Mishna. Wishing everyone a good day, and salot tavot, especially in light of this morning's complicated news. Wishing everyone a good day.